The first coalition that threatened to destroy the young French Republic was crushed. Now only Great Britain continued the war against France. All these victories over the coalitionists infatuated the members of the Directory, and they've now decided that everything is within their reach. Already a couple of months after the ratification of the Treaty of Campo Formio, the French soldiers under the command of General Brune invaded Switzerland and announced the creation of the Helvetic Republic. Also, the Directory again sent troops against Pope Pius VI. A reason for that was the assassination in Rome of the French General Dufaux, who was there on a diplomatic mission. As a result, the soldiers, commanded by General Berthier, took the Eternal City, and on February 15, 1798, an excited crowd gathered at the capital, announced the abolition of papal authority, and established the Roman Republic. The majority of the members of the Directory wanted to continue war actions at any cost, since they understood that their power wouldn't hold even a day after the general peace was announced. The Directory was dominated by its own weakness. In order to exist, it needed a perpetual state of war. In addition to operations in Italy and Switzerland, the government aimed its main efforts at war against Great Britain. It was absolutely clear that William Pitt wouldn't lose time organizing a new coalition. So, the French needed to apply the greatest effort and overcome their most insidious and dangerous enemy as soon as possible. For this goal, they formed a 120,000-strong army at the banks of La Manche, headed by the best general of the Republic, Bonaparte. Initially, the basic plan of the campaign provided for landing in England with the support of the French and allied Spanish fleet. In February 1798, Bonaparte departed from Paris to check the bridgehead of the future operation personally and assess the condition of the fleet. He traveled along the entire coastline from Brest to Dunkirk, and what he saw made him absolutely certain that this operation was impossible. No matter how much effort we make, even in 2 years, we won't achieve superiority at sea. Landing in England without full control of the seas is the boldest and most challenging operation ever undertaken. The right moment for it was lost. In the same report, Bonaparte presented alternative options. He recommended to the Directory that they use the troops concentrated in the north to attempt to push the English out of Hanover or launch a campaign to Egypt, which would jeopardize English trade with India. Bonaparte considered that if neither of these operations were feasible, peace should be pursued with Great Britain. However, the members of the Directory feared peace the most and ultimately chose in favor of the campaign to Egypt. The idea of this campaign had existed for a long time, and Bonaparte was not the first one to officially propose this plan for the government. On July 16, 1797, in the midst of the Italian campaign, a new minister of foreign affairs took office in Paris. It was Talleyrand. Just 2 weeks before his appointment, he had presented a detailed report at the Institute of France on the advantages that could be gained from new colonies in the current circumstances. It was in this report that Talleyrand voiced the plan concerning Egypt. In the autumn of the same year, with the assistance of the French consul in Cairo, Charles Magellan, he presented this plan to the government. However, at that time, against the backdrop of all the victories in Italy, the Directory showed little interest. And now, in February 1798, Bonaparte once again drew the government's attention to this plan. As a result, with active support from Talleyrand, the invasion plan for England was cancelled, and on April 12th, the Directory issued a series of secret decrees regarding the Egyptian campaign. First and foremost, Bonaparte was instructed to seize Malta, as there was information that the English intended to do so. Achieving this goal would provide the French fleet with a significant strategic advantage in the Mediterranean Sea, since Malta was a first-class naval base. After that, he was ordered to capture Egypt and displace the English from the east. this would potentially pose a serious threat to British colonies in India. At that time, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire. However, due to the empire's turbulent times, control over Egypt had largely been lost. Although the Ottoman Sultan Selim III remained the ruler of Egypt in name, real political and military power in Egypt was largely held by a special military class that governed Egypt almost independently. These were the Mamluks. These warriors were mostly recruited from the Eurasian steppe. Their leader was Murad Bey, and a total of 12,000 superb horsemen, known for their remarkable courage, were under his command. Thus, the Egyptian campaign had clearly defined goals and could genuinely influence the course of the war with England. It was generally believed that the operation to capture Egypt would take about 6 months. However, besides military reasons, the members of the Directory had political motives regarding this campaign. Bonaparte's presence in Paris posed a threat to the government, perhaps even greater than any coalition. After the triumphant Italian campaign, this unconventional general gained immense popularity in France. He was considered a true leader by the army, and soldiers were willing to follow him anywhere. He also enjoyed great authority among civilians. Upon his return to Paris, Bonaparte was elected a member of the mathematical section of the National Institute of France, the highest scientific institution of the Republic. This rapid rise of Bonaparte greatly alarmed the members of the Directory, and they wished to get rid of him as soon as possible. Give him employment a few thousand miles away, and there will be one less troublemaker at home. Let him do the heavy work, and if he succeeds, so much the better, and if he fails, good riddance. However, oddly enough, Bonaparte also found it advantageous to stay away from France. The greatest danger for him was inactivity. A passive, peaceful life in Paris would cause his fame to fade, and over time he would become just one of the generals among the crowd of unemployed officers. Thus, Bonaparte foresaw the benefits of active absence over passive presence in France, and to the surprise of many, he enthusiastically welcomed the government's approval of the Egyptian expedition. Preparations for the campaign began in March 1798. Speed and secrecy were essential parts of success. To mislead England about the true objectives, fake orders were actively issued, and publications in the press about an impending landing in Ireland were circulated. Also, to confuse the public, and especially the English, the troops gathering in the south of France were referred to as the left wing of the English army, and Bonaparte officially retained command of the English army until his departure. All of this led the English, who were engaged in securing La Manche, to send part of their fleet to the Strait of Gibraltar to block the French exit from the Mediterranean Sea. Meanwhile, Bonaparte was preparing for the campaign very energetically. Continuous work took place for 10 weeks. Everything was conducted with the utmost secrecy, and only a very small number of people knew the campaign's true objectives. The main bases for the concentration of land and sea forces were chosen in Toulon, Marseille, and Genoa. There were 5 such bases in total. The army that was supposed to take part in the Egyptian campaign numbered about 35,000 men and consisted of 5 infantry divisions. Among the divisional commanders were famous Republic generals such as Kleber, Régnier, and Deshayes. Bonaparte also formed additional units to serve as garrisons. The army staff was headed by irreplaceable Berthier. Commander Dumas commanded the cavalry with Murat and Lassalle under his command. The army consisted mainly of units that had distinguished themselves during the Italian campaign. To transport all these troops, nearly 400 sailing ships of various types were requisitioned and distributed among different ports. The ships were loaded with 100 days of food and 40 days of water. Additionally, 12,000 reserve muskets, 4,000 bottles of wine, large stocks of gunpowder, many artillery shells, tools, and much more were loaded. Bonaparte strictly prohibited taking wives and mistresses along. Only about 300 women from the service staff boarded the ships. However, some officers secretly ignored this prohibition. To accompany this massive naval convoy through the Mediterranean Sea, a squadron of 13 line ships and the same number of frigates were assigned. All naval forces were led by Vice Admiral Bruess, who was considered the Republic's best sailor. The squadron's flagship was the 118-gun battleship Orient. This formidable vessel was the pride of the entire French fleet. But that was not all. A unique feature of this campaign was the large number and high caliber of accompanying civilians. Out of 500 people, no fewer than 167 were renowned scholars, prominent figures in science and literature, and recognized experts in various fields of knowledge. This extensive list included such famous names as Gaspard Monge, Fourier, and Berthollet. The commission also included military Dr. Larrey, artist Denon, geologist Dolomier, and many others. The presence of such a large number of unquestionably distinguished civilians in the army was unprecedented. On May 19, 1798, French ships set sail. The squadron moved at a leisurely pace, maintaining formation. A remarkable atmosphere prevailed on board the ships. Almost every evening, Bonaparte held seminars with scientists where various scientific topics were discussed. However, not everyone found the scientific community interesting. Some officers were dissatisfied with the absence of women, and many soldiers suffered from seasickness. However, the situation for the French was much more dangerous than they thought. 3 days before their departure from Toulon, Admiral Nelson's squadron, consisting of 3 battleships and 2 frigates, entered the Mediterranean Sea. The English found out about the extensive preparations in Toulon, and Nelson was tasked with reconnaissance. By May 19th, Nelson's squadron was already heading for Toulon, but their plans were disrupted by a sudden storm, during which the entire squadron was scattered. Nelson himself narrowly avoided disaster aboard the Vanguard, which lost its mast during the storm. It took 4 days to make repairs, and Nelson wasn't able to approach Toulon until 8 days after his prey had slipped away. Nonetheless, the English became aware that a massive French squadron was in the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore they had an excellent opportunity to strike a devastating blow to the French. On June 7th, Trowbridge's squadron, consisting of 11 line ships, joined Admiral Nelson. Without them, Nelson would have had little chance of stopping Bruess's fleet of 13 battleships. Now, the British and French squadrons were roughly equal in firepower. However, Nelson had the advantage in other parameters. So, after having received reinforcements, Nelson began to cruise along Italy's coast in search of the French. Meanwhile, on June 9th, the French fleet reached the shores of Malta. The sight of 400 ships was a terrifying spectacle for the local population. Malta had never seen such an enormous fleet in its waters. At that time, the Maltese Knights ruled Malta. It was a religious military order founded during the Crusades. Originally, the order was entrusted with the mission of caring for the Holy Land and protecting it. However, the Crusades had long ended, and by the end of the 18th century, the order had lost its reason to exist and was in decline, with the knights themselves already accustomed to living a peaceful and comfortable life. There were a total of 800 knights in Malta, most of whom were French. In addition, there were about 3,000 disorganized and undisciplined militiamen and mercenaries. Nonetheless, Malta's fortifications were so powerful and numerous that even under the current circumstances, the garrison could easily withstand a long siege. The formal pretext for the capture was that the Grand Master had refused to allow more than 4 French ships at a time to enter the main harbor to replenish their drinking water. So, at the dawn of the next day, a landing force disembarked on the island. There were select units from the divisions of Dese and Régnier. They quickly stormed the coastal fortifications, and by 8 a.m., the entire coastal area was in French hands. As expected, the island's defenders didn't wish to fight and demonstrated only symbolic resistance. As a result, on June 12th, aboard the Orient, the Act of Capitulation was signed, which provided for the transfer of all of Malta's forts over to the French troops. The French spent 6 days on Malta. During this time, Bonaparte accomplished a tremendous amount of work. He dictated no fewer than 160 reports, dispatches, and orders, and implemented a multitude of reforms. The entire feudal system on the island was abolished. The Inquisition and slavery in any form were prohibited. All political prisoners on the island were released. The Grand Master and members of the order were expelled from the island, and they were granted substantial pensions in compensation. In addition, a new system of primary and secondary education was established in Malta, the entire economy was restructured, and much more. At the same time, the treasures of the order, amounting to around 7 million francs, were confiscated. Thus, at the cost of the lives of 3 killed soldiers, the French gained an invaluable naval base and a substantial amount of treasures. Bonaparte ordered a garrison of 4,000 soldiers under the command of General Vaubois to be stationed on the island. So on June 19th, exactly 1 month after the French left Toulon, the squadron's flagships signaled departure. Then the French fleet was to proceed to Alexandria without any further stops. In the future, the capture of Malta would lead to serious diplomatic complications with nations that had long dreamed of seizing this strategically important island. Among the French, it sparked an explosion of enthusiasm, and Bonaparte's soldiers eagerly wished to finally reach the city founded by Alexander the Great. However, they didn't even suspect that the fate of the entire squadron hung by a thread at this very moment, because Admiral Nelson had already reached Naples and learned of the whereabouts of the French squadron. On June 19, 1798, the French fleet, departing from Malta, set sail eastward toward the shores of Egypt. This massive naval convoy, consisting of over 400 heavily loaded ships of various types, stretched for many miles. Consequently, the speed of the squadron was quite slow. However, this didn't deter Admiral Brueys's sailors, as they were confident that nothing would stop them from reaching Alexandria. The entire crew's spirits are high. We've just sung revolutionary anthems together. However, it was too early for the French to celebrate. 2 days before the French left Malta, the British squadron had already entered the Bay of Naples. Sir William Hamilton, the British ambassador in Naples, urgently conveyed crucial information to Admiral Nelson. The French fleet had been spotted near Malta. Thus, the appropriate location of the French squadron was determined. At the same time, it was evident that Malta was not the French's ultimate destination, and after consulting with his senior captains, Nelson quickly concluded that the French were heading for Egypt. Although Nelson correctly anticipated the French plans, he mistakenly believed that Admiral Brueys's squadron was at least 6 days ahead of the British squadron. Therefore, Nelson decided to set sail immediately at full speed toward Alexandria. The task was simple: catch up with and destroy the French convoy. In preparation for a naval battle, Nelson ordered the squadron to be split into 2 groups. The first, commanded by Admiral Trowbridge, was to sink the French transport ships, while the second group, led by Nelson himself, was to battle Admiral Brueys's battleships. Without wasting a moment, Nelson embarked on a pursuit at full sail. On June 20th, his squadron passed through the Strait of Messina and began heading southeast. Finally, on the night of June 23rd, the courses of the two fleets intersected. However, neither the British nor the French had any inkling of it. At the moment of critical proximity, the distance between the fleets was just 26 nautical miles. On that night, some French sailors even heard the signal shots exchanged by the British ships. Nevertheless, luck was once again on Bonaparte's side. The dark night and the sluggishness of the convoy helped the French remain unnoticed at this very dangerous moment. Thus, completely unaware, Nelson raced past the French at high speed and continued moving eastward. In all subsequent days, the British squadron sailed at twice the speed of the heavily loaded French convoy. Eventually, on June 28th, Nelson reached Alexandria, where complete disappointment awaited him. All Nelson could find in Alexandria were a few dilapidated Turkish warships. Meanwhile, the French convoy, having bypassed the island of Candia, was leisurely approaching the shores of Egypt, and when the expedition's objective became clear to everyone, Bonaparte addressed his troops. Soldiers, you are about to undertake a conquest, the effects of which on civilization and commerce are incalculable. The blow you are about to give to England will be the most sensibly felt. We must make some fatiguing marches and fight several battles. We shall succeed in all we undertake. Destiny is with us. The people amongst whom we are going to live are Mohammedans. The first article of their faith is this: there is but one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Do not contradict them. Behave to them as you behaved to the Jews and to the Italians. Pay respect to their muftis and their imams, as you did to the rabbis and the bishops. Extend to the ceremonies prescribed by the Quran and the mosques the same toleration which you showed to the synagogues, to the religion of Moses and of Jesus Christ. The Roman legions protected all religions. You will here find customs different from those of Europe. You must accommodate yourselves to them. The people we're going to be friends with differ from us in the treatment of women, but in all countries, anyone who violates is considered a monster. The first town we shall come to was built by Alexander. At every step, we shall meet with grand recollections. At the same time, Nelson was in Alexandria, completely unaware that those he was searching for were heading straight toward him. His frustration was immense at that moment. Teetering on the brink of a nervous breakdown, he made a decision that once again saved the French fleet. Believing that the French had gone north, he ordered his squadron to set sail immediately for the island of Cyprus. As a result, as soon as the last British ship left port, the first French frigate entered the harbor of Alexandria during the second half of the same day. Thus, both fleets once again missed each other. The main convoy approached Alexandria on July 1st. Bonaparte was informed that the British squadron had departed quite recently, so the situation remained very dangerous. By this time, the entire convoy was out of formation. Warships had mingled with transport vessels and became practically helpless. In this situation, Admiral Bruce proposed to the commander-in-chief that they start landing troops the next morning. However, Bonaparte decided not to test his luck any further, and despite unfavorable weather conditions, he ordered an immediate landing. Because the port of Alexandria was unsuited for such a large number of ships, he decided to land troops on Marabou Beach, which was approximately 8 miles west of Alexandria. The operation to land troops began around noon. The sea storm continued to worsen, and the proximity of Nelson's squadron turned this operation into a grueling ordeal that lasted all night. As a result, some boats took 8 hours to cover 3 miles. During this operation, 19 people drowned. Nevertheless, despite all the difficulties, around 8 p.m., the first French troops reached shore. They were soldiers from General Menu's division. The commander-in-chief, accompanied by Generals Berthier and Doumartin, reached shore around 1 a.m. By this time, Kleber, Menu, and Bonn had managed to land only about 4,000 men. The other boats with troops, battling the storm, slowly approached the shore. Nevertheless, the commander-in-chief believed that there was no time to waste. At 3 a.m., under a bright moon, Bonaparte reviewed the troops and then ordered Kleber, Menu, and Bonn's divisions to begin their march to The soldiers, exhausted after a long night of landing without artillery and cavalry and even without food packs, began their march through the desert. Bonaparte led the way, with General Caffarelli beside him, who limped through the sand with a wooden leg, as well as Dumas and Domartin. On July 2nd, around 8 a.m., the French troops reached Alexandria. By this time, the heat and thirst had become unbearable. Manou's division approached the city from the west. Bonn circled Alexandria from the east, Kleber and Bonaparte in the center. Approximately 600 janissaries defended Alexandria. Some city residents also helped defend the city. Alexandria's extensive walls were quite high, but they had numerous breaches and openings through which one could penetrate the city. After an unsuccessful attempt to enter into negotiations with the city's defenders, Bonaparte, after inspecting the fortifications from Pompey's pillar pedestal, ordered his troops to attack. At around 9 a.m., even without ladders, the French troops launched an assault on Alexandria. As they approached the walls, the attackers encountered fairly strong gunfire. Stones and spears were also hurled from the city walls at the French. Several officers were killed in the first minutes of the assault. For the French soldiers, after an exhausting night, this assault was clearly no simple task. However, in this situation, the divisional generals displayed leadership. Sensing the soldiers' fatigue, they led the assault in the forefront, and their bravery encouraged the soldiers to attack. Divisional General Kleber was one of the first to climb the wall, but at that very moment, he suffered a serious head wound. Divisional General Manou also was hit in the head by a stone and was knocked from the wall. Yet, after an hour of battle, the defense was breached. Bonn's division, attacking the city from the east, was the first to break in and finally overcome resistance. After that, Alexandria's defenders wavered and begged for mercy, fearing that the city would be looted and burned. However, their fears were in vain in this case. Discipline in Bonaparte's army was extremely strict. Even before the landing, the commander-in-chief issued a series of orders aimed at combating looting and violence. According to these orders, anyone, regardless of rank, who committed robbery, extortion, or violence against the local population would be immediately shot in front of the formation. On that day, about 250 people were wounded. Among the wounded were Division Generals Kleber, Manou, and Lescal. I ordered all the wounded to be transported to the Capuchin monastery, which eventually became a highly frequented establishment. The rest of our troops set up camp amidst the ruins of Alexandria. On this day, one of our soldiers was stung by a scorpion, which was much larger than the European ones. The soldier was greatly frightened by the sting. I immediately treated the sting site with an alkaline solution, and fortunately, it helped, and the soldier got off lightly. Around noon, the city was under complete control, and the French tricolor flag fluttered over the formidable citadel of Aboukir Bay. Soon, transport ships began to enter the city's port, and the French began a massive unloading of supplies, artillery, and all other equipment. Bonaparte also got to work. His top priority was to gain the trust and goodwill of the local residents at any cost. The population of Egypt was around 7 million people, and it was essential to prevent a popular uprising. The French declared that they had infinite respect for Islam and were not at war with Muslims. The fight was exclusively against the Mamluks, who had exploited this magnificent land, and such an approach to the population of Egypt was not without reason. The Mamluks and their leaders cared very little for the well-being of the people of Egypt. Knowing nothing but horsemanship and warfare, they lived in palaces, actively exploiting the peasants. Therefore, the fight against the Mamluks could indeed find support among the residents. Right after the French troops occupied Alexandria, Bonaparte was presented with the city's commandant and other prominent figures. Arriving at the headquarters in the morning, I found Bonaparte surrounded by the city's dignitaries and members of the previous government. Receiving the oath of allegiance from the city's commandant, Bonaparte said to him, "I took you prisoner with your weapons in hand. I could have treated you as a prisoner, but you showed courage, and since I believe that this is inseparable from honor, I return your weapons to you, and I hope you will serve the Republic faithfully, just as you did the previous authorities." Additionally, all Muslim captives were released. Also, an order was immediately issued to ensure that all the city's mosques continued their services. On the same day, Bonaparte ordered a large number of proclamations to be posted around the city and distributed to the residents in French, Arabic, and Turkish languages. Their primary message conveyed that the French were friends of the Egyptian people and were exclusively at war with the Mamluks. As a result, the situation in Alexandria stabilized quite quickly, and residents began returning to their homes. Within a few days, the city's muftis and sheikhs signed a joint declaration pledging their allegiance to the commander-in-chief. He solemnly accepted and reassured them. Bedouins also arrived in Alexandria to get acquainted with the French. The sight of these desert dwellers excited the soldiers' curiosity, and everything they saw in the French army stirred great interest in Bedouins too. They touched everything and examined the French personal belongings with great curiosity. An agreement was reached with the Bedouins as well. They undertook to guard the roads leading from Alexandria, sell 300 horses and 500 dromedaries to the French, and lease 1,000 Bactrian camels. After that, a common meal was served, and the Bedouins dined with the commander-in-chief. However, the French had no intention of staying in Alexandria, and soon they began preparing for the march to Cairo, where Murad Bey had already started gathering his army. Before embarking on the campaign to Cairo, Bonaparte addressed the people of Egypt. People of Egypt, you will be told by our enemies that I have come to destroy your religion. Believe them not. Tell them that I have come to restore your rights and punish your usurpers. Tell them that I respect not the Mamluks, but God, His Prophet, and the Quran. Tell them that all men are equal in the eyes of God, and that wisdom, talents, and virtue alone constitute the difference between them. And what are the virtues which distinguish the Mamluks, that entitle them to appropriate all the enjoyments of life to themselves? But God is just and merciful, and He hath ordained that the empire of the Mamluks shall come to an end. Thrice happy those who shall side with us, they shall prosper in their fortune and their rank. Happy they who shall be neutral, they will have time to become acquainted with us and will range themselves upon our side. But woe, threefold woe, to those who shall arm for the Mamluks and fight against us. For them there will be no hope, they shall perish. Within just a few days after the French army took Alexandria by storm, the commander-in-chief ordered preparations for a march to Cairo. Bonaparte was convinced that any delay would be fatal and that they needed to enter Cairo as quickly as possible, preventing the enemy from fortifying this large city. There were two roads from Alexandria to Cairo, and Bonaparte planned the march as follows. A division under the command of General Dugas would go along the coast to Rosetta and then turn south, following the Nile to the village of Rahmani. The French would have to cover over 55 miles along this route. This route was the longest among the possibilities, but it was also the easiest, as the troops would have continual access to fresh water. General Kleber, who had not yet fully recovered from his injury, remained in Alexandria to command a 2,000-strong garrison. General Manu, also wounded, was to lead the garrison in Rosetta. The main part of the army would take the shortest path through the desert. In Rahmani, Bonaparte planned to reunite the army and continue the march to Cairo already along the Nile, accompanied by Admiral Perde's light squadron. Despite the scorching heat in Egypt at that time, crossing the desert did not raise particular concerns. Alexandria was not far from Damanhur, just over 30 miles. The French had covered this distance in less than 2 days during the Italian campaign. However, the current situation turned out to be much more horrifying. On July 4th, Desaix's division set out first into the desert. To avoid the heat, the troops began their movement in the evening and marched through the night. However, within a day of marching, the soldiers experienced a stark contrast to the beautiful fields of Lombardy. What was marked on the map as villages turned out to be abandoned huts with wells filled with sand. As a result, the troops quickly exhausted their water supplies and began to suffer terribly under the blazing sun. Even General Desaix, who extremely rarely expressed dissatisfaction, sent daily reports to Bonaparte complaining about the unbearable conditions and urgently requesting supplies and water. I am in great need of supplies. The villages are no more than clay huts devoid of all resources. Troops are losing morale and starting to grumble. I implore you, General, do not leave us in this situation. As soon as we get out of this dreadful situation, I hope I can find what I need on my own and never bother you again. I'm distressed that I have to speak to you in such a concerned tone, but if the entire army doesn't cross the desert swiftly, it will perish. Following Desaix, the other divisions marched along the same route. The commander-in-chief and his staff joined the troops in the desert on July 7th. Before leaving Alexandria, Bonaparte ordered Admiral Bruess to find the necessary waterway and station the squadron in the port of Alexandria, or, if that wasn't possible, to sail to a safer location near the island of Corfu. Meanwhile, the condition of the French forces marching through the desert rapidly deteriorated. Just before the start of the march, the Bedouin tribes had received a fatwa from the ulamas and sheikhs of Cairo, instructing them to take up arms to defend the faith of the Prophet against the infidels. This changed their previously amicable intentions. They nullified all agreements with the French and began to see them as enemies. The Bedouins were constantly on the flanks, behind and in front of the army. They skillfully ambushed any soldiers who fell behind them, killing them. The army was engulfed in a kind of terror. Everything was unknown to them. The soldiers' fevered imaginations generated various rumors. Rumors spread among the troops that a Mamluk horseman was so strong that he could decapitate a bull with a single blow of his sword. Nonetheless, the soldiers had no other choice but to march forward on the scorching sand. Many soldiers went mad while the columns trudged forward, and a few even shot themselves. All of this pushed many units to the verge of mutiny. The mood among the senior officers wasn't much better, and Bonaparte had to respond harshly to it to maintain control over the army. Never before had an army had to endure such great vicissitudes and painful deprivations. Stricken by the scorching rays of the sun, everyone marched on foot across even more scorching sands, crossing vast plains of daunting aridity. I saw soldiers, renowned for their physical strength, fall from exhaustion, overcome by thirst and heat. Deceptive, watery plains seemed to offer us respite from our miseries, but this illusion was only there to plunge us into even greater despondency. My assistance became almost useless. The loss of strength of some of our bravest men had reached its limit. Nevertheless, I managed to revive quite a significant number of soldiers with a small amount of fresh water diluted with drops of sweet wine that I carried with me. Numerous Arab legions followed our march, constantly harassing our detachments. Woe to the soldiers who fell out of line. A painful death awaited them. Yet, after the most arduous marches, Bonaparte gathered 4 demoralized divisions in Damanhur and gave them 2 days of rest. This small town became a true salvation for the soldiers. There, they found enough clean water to quench their thirsts and refresh themselves, as well as to buy provisions at the local market. Surprisingly for the French, the market traders preferred payment in the form of buttons from the soldiers' uniforms rather than money. After a 2-day respite in Damanhur, the French, having gathered their strength, embarked on another challenging march to Rahmani, and finally, on July 10th, the exhausted soldiers caught sight of the Nile River. As soon as we saw the river, officers, soldiers, and everyone else rushed into it. Not a single soldier stopped to take off his uniform and knapsack. Each one was eager to quench his thirst and bent down to drink. The entire army, in this way, resembled a herd of sheep to me. After leaving the river, we found ourselves in fields covered with a multitude of melons and watermelons, which soon made us forget the suffering of the desert. Indeed, as we approached the Nile, the landscape of the country changed dramatically. The luscious vegetation met our gaze. Trees, which we hadn't seen since leaving Italy, offered us their shade, the value of which can only be appreciated by those who have walked through a desert. Thus, all divisions were assembled on the banks of the Nile, and a small squadron of Admiral Perde anchored alongside the army. On the night of July 11th, the French resumed their march to Cairo. The soldiers no longer suffered from a lack of water. They also had an abundance of such foods as melons, watermelons, rice, and lentils. The only things missing were bread and wine. And in the meantime, the Mamluks began to take countermeasures. In Cairo, an emergency divan convened to discuss the situation. Mamluk beys, sheikhs, and other emirs attended the divan. When Murad Bey heard that the armies of infidels had a sizable infantry but lacked cavalry, he laughed loudly and declared that they would cut them down like watermelons. This filled those present with optimism. Everyone was certain of victory over the foreign infantry, and each Mamluk promised to bring 100 French heads to Cairo. In the end, the divan decided to divide the available army. Murad Bey, with 3,000 Mamluks and several thousand Janissaries, was to go along the Nile to delay the French, while Ibrahim Bey was tasked with assembling the remaining troops near Cairo. So, gathering his desert knights, Murad Bey set out to meet the French. Finally, at dawn on July 13th, near the village of Shubrakit, the French saw Murad Bey's cavalry before them. The sun, reflecting off the Mamluks' helmets and armor, gave this splendid army a special brilliance. For several hours, the troops stood and observed each other. To intimidate the enemy, the Mamluks demonstrated their equestrian skills on their magnificent Arabian steeds. Each warrior carried an entire arsenal. In addition to their carbine, each Mamluk was armed with a pair of pistols, several pikes, and a scimitar studded with precious stones. However, this spectacle had no intimidating effect on the veterans of the Italian campaign. To boost the morale of his troops, Bonaparte ordered the playing of the Marseillaise. After that, the command was given to form a square.
Par peloton de droite et de gauche, formez le carré!
At sunrise, martial music suddenly burst forth. The commander-in-chief ordered the Marseillaise to be played because he knew its effect on the troops. This wonderful song inflames the courage of the soldiers, kindles their patriotism, and makes them understand that the time for complaints has passed and that victory is their main task. The formation of the French army did not perturb Murad Bey, and around 8 a.m., the Mamluk cavalry launched an attack. As soon as the enemy came into range, the French opened heavy fire. The roar of the artillery did not frighten the Mamluks, and they galloped through the French ranks to attack them from behind. However, the Mamluks were surprised to find that the infantry was protected from all sides. After this, they began to dart around the infantry square in confusion, looking for weak points. This continued for about half an hour, after which the Mamluks withdrew and returned to their original positions. Meanwhile, a much fiercer battle was taking place on the Nile. Around 9 a.m., 5 small French vessels were in a precarious position, battling against 7 larger Mamluk ships. Around 11 a.m., Admiral Perde informed me that if the land forces did not come to his aid immediately, the situation would be hopeless. The Mamluks had already boarded several ships, killing our sailors with barbaric fury, and then showing us the severed heads, holding them by the hair. What they witnessed had a shocking effect on the scholars who were on the transport boats nearby. Some of them were ready to jump into the river to avoid falling into the hands of the Mamluks. However, the situation improved when Bonaparte ordered field artillery to be brought to support the fleet, and at 12 a.m., the Mamluk flagship was successfully blown up by a well-aimed shot. At the same time, Bond's division advanced and drove the enemy infantry out of the village of Shubrakit. As a result, after a brief resistance, Murad Bey decided to retreat to Cairo. This brief battle at Shubrakit shook the Mamluks' confidence. Cairo was quickly filled with alarming rumors. The infidels advancing on Cairo have nails of a foot long, huge mouths, and ferocious eyes. They are savages possessed by the devil, and they go into battle in chains. On the contrary, the French gained confidence after this battle, and all the fears caused by the unknown were dispelled. The march to Cairo continued, and on July 20th, the French reached the village of Dinar, which was 18 miles from Cairo. Bonaparte ordered the entire army to form a square and march towards the capital. Leading the way, to the beat of drums, was Desaix's division. Finally, on the morning of July 21st, Napoleon's 18,000-strong army reached the village of Bitil, and before the French, a majestic scene unfolded. To the right of them, the pyramids loomed, and at first, all eyes were focused on these great ancient monuments. To the left of the French, on the opposite bank of the Nile, were the magnificent mosques of Cairo, and in the center, the Mamluk army stood with unfurled banners and tents. This sight left a vivid impression on the soldiers due to its novelty and richness. From this moment on, their thoughts were solely focused on the upcoming battle. In total, the Beys were able to gather around 30,000 people for the defense of Cairo, but only about 12,000 of them could effectively engage in combat. The others were armed with sticks and were incapable of taking action in battle formation on the plains. The main force that could resist the French, as before, was the Mamluks. There were about 7,000 of them under the walls of Cairo. Also, on the right flank of Murad Bey's army, there was an Imbamware fortified camp defended by several thousand janissaries. Ibrahim Bey's militia was on the island of Bulak. Bonaparte applied the same tactics as in the Battle of Shubrakit. Each division was formed into a huge infantry square, 6 ranks deep. Vulnerable corners were covered by artillery. The small number of cavalry was in the center of the square. On the right flank was Desaix's square, supported on the left by Regnier's division. Vial and Bonn were on the left flank, opposite the enemy camp. In the center was Dugas' division inside of the square of which Bonaparte and his staff were positioned. The superiority of the French was evident. However, after a grueling march, the soldiers were significantly weakened, and the slightest panic could lead to a catastrophe. Therefore, everything depended on discipline and order. Moreover, Bonaparte's army was effectively surrounded, since Bedouins following the French had already cut off all the roads. Finally, the drums beat, and Bonaparte said to his troops, pointing to the pyramids, "Forward, soldiers, and remember that 40 centuries are watching you from the tops of these pyramids." At around 3 p.m., 7,000 horsemen rushed to the attack with wild shouts. The main hit was directed at the French right flank, but the division squares closed ranks in time and met the attackers with musket volleys. Very quickly, Desaix's square found itself completely surrounded and isolated from the others. Communication between the infantry squares was lost. Due to the smoke and dust in the air, Desaix's division was barely visible, and in those moments of uncertainty, many became anxious for the right flank. In the chaos, it seemed that the Mamluks were about to break the square's formation. However, the musket volleys coming from the right flank signaled that Desaix's division was still holding its ground. The division commander and his subordinates displayed exceptional fortitude and composure. Withstanding the initial Mamluk assault, Desaix ordered his troops to close ranks and fire when ready.
Serrez vos rangs! Feu de file!
General Regnier's infantry square was also surrounded and subjected to numerous attacks. However, the crossfire from the two divisions inflicted serious losses on the Mamluks. After mass attacks on the French left flank, the Mamluks streamed into the village of Bitil, where several grenadier companies were stationed. However, the soldiers managed to rush into the houses and put up an effective defense. In the end, 2 grenadier companies under Dorsen's command successfully repelled the cavalry attack, which proved ineffective in urban combat. For another hour, the Mamluks continued to launch violent attacks on infantry squares, but they were met with a hail of fire everywhere. Their courage was impressive, but courage alone is not enough to defeat a disciplined army in proper battle formation. Meanwhile, after ensuring that the right flank had repelled the cavalry attack, Bonaparte, on the opposite flank, ordered General Bond's division to counterattack.
En avant! Marche!
The assault columns were led into the attack by Brigadier General Rampon. The enemy's artillery fire didn't deter the French, and in less than 15 minutes, Rampon's soldiers, with a bayonet charge, crushed the Janissary corps and destroyed the Mbambwer fortified camp. The surviving Mamluks and Janissaries, in desperation, began throwing themselves into the Nile, attempting to swim across to join Ibrahim Bey's forces, who just watched what was happening. However, not everyone managed to swim across the Nile. Thus, the Mamluk camp was defeated, and all the cavalry attacks were repelled. This brief battle ended around 4:30 p.m. The French army lost about 300 men, killed and wounded, while the enemy lost over 3,000 people killed, wounded, and drowned. Murad Bey and the surviving 3,000 Mamluks fled to Giza. Ibrahim Bey left Cairo during the night and went to the east. After the flight of the Mamluks, Cairo was engulfed in a wave of looting, panic, and riots. Horrified by the situation, the sheikhs and imams of Cairo approached the French for negotiations the next day. Bonaparte declared that the French army would not harm either the city or its residents. The French only wished to enter Cairo in an orderly and disciplined manner. The delegation was pleased with the reception it received and hastened back to Cairo to reassure the inhabitants. As a result, on July 22nd, the French army entered Cairo. At Murad Bey's estate, the French discovered magnificent fruit orchards, vineyards, and many other eastern riches. On the same day, proclamations from the commander-in-chief were posted throughout the city. Residents of Cairo, I am pleased with your behavior. I have come to destroy the Mamluks, protect trade, and the country's native inhabitants. Let those who are consumed by fear find peace. Let those who have departed return. Let prayer go on today as usual. Do not fear for your families, homes, property, and especially for the religion of the Prophet, whom I greatly love. After this, the sheikhs of Cairo called Bonaparte the Just Sultan. However, instead of the sweet taste of victory, Bonaparte would soon face bitter disappointment. Talking with Junot, Bonaparte learned an unpleasant secret, revealing that Josephine had been unfaithful to him and had long had a lover in France. This news deeply affected Bonaparte. I have a great personal sorrow. All doubts have vanished. You alone remain for me on this earth. If I lose your friendship, I will go completely mad. It's so hard when all the love in my heart is given to one woman. I am disappointed in human nature. I need solitude and rest. I have grown tired of glory. My feelings have dried up, and I'm left with nothing but to become an egoist. However, Bonaparte would quickly forget his troubles with Josephine, as it wouldn't be more than 2 weeks before he and the entire army had to seriously consider their survival. It took Bonaparte 23 days to defeat the Mamluks, capture Cairo, and virtually control all of Lower Egypt. The campaign's pace was impressive, and everything seemed to be unfolding exceptionally well. The only concern bothering Bonaparte during these days was the fate of the French fleet. Before leaving Alexandria, Bonaparte ordered Admiral Bruess to station the squadron in the city's port. If that proved impossible, the squadron should head to the island of Corfu. While searching for a suitable fairway to enter Alexandria's port, Bruess's squadron temporarily anchored in Aboukir Bay. However, it soon became clear that sailing to the Ionian Islands was unnecessary because Captain Barre conducted a detailed depth survey around Alexandria, and on July 13th, he reported to Brues that the water depth allowed safe entry into the port. I've been informed from Alexandria that you've finally found the necessary fairway to enter the port. I hope that as I write you this letter, you are in the harbor with your squadron, safe and sound. I haven't received a single letter from you since leaving Alexandria. Please let me know as soon as possible what you have been doing up to this time and in what situation you are now. Thus, nothing prevented the French admiral from executing the commander-in-chief's order and placing the squadron in the port. However, for inexplicable reasons, Brues ignored Bonaparte's instructions and stayed in Aboukir Bay. Meanwhile, as if sensing approaching danger, Bonaparte, after entering Cairo, issued a repeated order to Brues. General Bonaparte's concern was so great that during his march from Alexandria to Cairo, he not only wrote twice to Admiral Brues asking him to enter the port of Alexandria or sail to Corfu, but he also sent his adjutant Jolien to oversee the order's execution. Nevertheless, Bonaparte's adjutant couldn't prevent the impending catastrophe. On July 30th, on the way to Abukir, Jolien fell into an ambush and was stabbed by Arabs. Despite Brues's actions contradicting the commander-in-chief's orders, Aboukir Bay couldn't be considered a bad position for a defensive battle. Fort Abukir and the shallow waters could serve as effective cover for the French squadron. However, Brues displayed extremely strange self-confidence and carelessness. 13 French battleships lined up and anchored more than 1.5 miles from the shore, at least half a mile farther than necessary to avoid shallow waters. This resulted in Fort Abukir and the shallows not providing full cover for the French squadron. Additionally, Admiral Brues took no precautionary measures. Not a single French frigate was sent out to sea for reconnaissance. Meanwhile, about 30% of the ship's crews were constantly ashore. Due to this negligence, Admiral Brues failed to gain any advantage from this disposition. And in such a vulnerable position on August 1st, around 2 p.m., the French noticed sails on the horizon. It was Nelson's squadron approaching. Initially, the French could see 12 British ships approaching with all sails set in a free formation. 2 other line battleships were to the west of Alexandria, out of sight. The forces of the French and the British were roughly equal. The French fleet of 13 ships of the line and 4 frigates carried 1,196 guns. The British fleet of 13 ships of the line and 1 gunship carried 1,012 guns. Brues gave the signal for battle alert only an hour after detecting the enemy. However, upon hearing the alert signal, the French sailors ashore couldn't quickly return to the ships, as there were very few boats available for this purpose. Meanwhile, around 4 p.m., Admiral Nelson ordered the leading ships to slow down to organize the fleet's formation. Nelson's plan was to concentrate all efforts on the French ships in the vanguard and center. The wind direction favored this plan and ensured that the second half of the French fleet wouldn't be able to quickly join the battle and support the vanguard. Nelson's orders were quite general, giving each captain complete freedom in their execution. Around 5 p.m., Brues convened a meeting on the flagship. The prevailing opinion in the French squadron was that the battle would be postponed to the next day, for it seemed unthinkable that Nelson would engage in battle with only those ships he had in sight. Moreover, during the attempt to approach the French, the British ship of the line, Culloden, had already run aground. However, regardless, Nelson had no intention of delaying the battle and ordered to continue closing in on the French squadron's vanguard. The French brig attempted to lure the enemy into shallow waters but was ignored by the leading British ships. Leading the squadron was the Goliath under the command of Captain Thomas Foley. This proactive captain intended to drop anchor near the French ship. However, caught up in the wind, the ship circumvented the French defensive line and positioned itself between the shore and the French ships. The fact that the Goliath didn't run aground was a complete surprise to everyone. Captain Foley was astonished that the French ships didn't open fire on him from the left side. It later turned out that the French were completely unprepared to fire from the left side, as they were confident that the British ships couldn't pass through to their rear. For this reason, the left side of many ships was cluttered with debris and various cargoes. At that moment, without wasting a minute, the captain of the battleship Zealous, Samuel Hood, ordered to immediately follow the Goliath, ignoring the gunfire from Fort Aboukir. James Saumarez followed Captain Hood along with 2 more battleships. The initiative and autonomy of the English captains played a decisive role at the beginning of the battle. Thus, 5 British battleships anchored behind the French line and opened rapid fire on the French ships. At the same time, the second group of battleships led by Nelson approached the French from the opposite side. Brueys's dispositions were immediately set at naught. Urgent countermeasures were demanded from him, but the French squadron remained motionless at anchor. As a result, the vanguard was quickly engulfed and found itself under crossfire. Closing the distance, Nelson unleashed a powerful barrage on the right side of the French ships. Saumarez, Hood, and Foley were firing at the left side of the Guerrier and the Concurrent. As a result, in less than an hour of battle, the forward French battleships suffered critical damage. The Guerrier lost all 3 masts and sustained over 50 breaches below the waterline. On the Concurrent, out of 500 crew members, about 300 were killed or wounded. The Spartiate suffered severe damage too. Captain Antoine Thévenard of the Aiguillon was killed. In this situation, the frigate Sérieuse attempted to aid the leading ships, but the broadside from James Saumarez's battleship demolished the French frigate. Thus, after a successful attack on the French vanguard, the British began advancing towards the center. However, here they faced much more serious resistance. At 6 p.m., the Orient entered the battle. The British battleship Bellerophon was the first to feel the power of the broadside from the French flagship. The damages received by Bellerophon were critical, forcing it to lower its flag and cease the fight. The central battleship Franklin and the 80-gun Tanon also joined the battle. These were among the best battleships in the French fleet. Thus, despite the initiative still belonging to Nelson, the outcome of the battle was by no means decided. 2 out of the 14 British ships, Culloden and Bellerophon, were disabled. In the French line, Guerrier and Concurrent practically ceased resistance, while the remaining battleships were either still firing or hadn't yet entered the battle. If Villeneuve had raised sails and come to Brueys's aid, the French had a good chance of winning. However, Villeneuve remained inactive, standing at anchor, watching the squadron being destroyed. Meanwhile, the situation at the French center worsened. Nelson concentrated the fire of 3 battleships against the French flagship. Nevertheless, the Orient continued to put up desperate resistance. The cannonade was horrifying. Around 7:30 p.m., a cannonball tore off Brueys's left thigh. This wound proved fatal. The French admiral categorically refused to leave the command post and met his death on the quarterdeck. By this time, Nelson was also wounded in the head, but the injury turned out to be superficial. About half an hour after Brueys's death, the lagging British battleships joined the battle, and Nelson intensified the pressure on the center. British sailors displayed the utmost energy and skill possible. Now, the 5 British battleships were firing point blank at Orient. The situation of the French flagship was hopeless. Soon, a rapidly spreading fire broke out on the ship. By this time, the ship's captain, Casabianca, heroically died. Despite this, French sailors tried their best to extinguish the blaze, but all was in vain. Around 10:30 p.m., the finest ship in the French fleet exploded. The explosion was so powerful that the roar was heard within a 25-mile radius. The sea and surrounding ships were showered with burning debris from the destroyed French flagship. This deafening explosion shocked everyone so much that the battle was temporarily halted. French and British ships made desperate efforts to rescue survivors, but only about 70 people from the entire crew of Orient were saved. After the destruction of the French squadron flagship and Brues's death, the advantage was clearly on Nelson's side. Nevertheless, the French still put up resistance. The broadside from the battleship Franklin shattered the silence, and soon the battle resumed. When the Franklin resumed firing, it had lost 2 masts. Practically all guns on the main deck were dismantled, 2/3 of the ship's crew were killed or wounded, and those remaining were completely drained. Our ship was surrounded by enemy battleships, and they mercilessly fired on us with point-blank broadsides. In this condition, the Franklin continued the fight for an hour. At 11:30 p.m., it lowered its flag. Spartiate and Sovereign, riddled through and through, surrendered around the same time. Despite the battle's outcome being apparent, the battleship Tanan continued to fight desperately. The brave ship's captain, Hubert du Poutitois, severely injured with limbs torn off, refused to surrender and commanded until his last breath. The Tanan kept firing until 3 a.m. By this time, almost the entire crew was killed or wounded, and the ship was almost completely destroyed. When the sun rose, the firing practically ceased. In the rear guard, there were still undamaged ships capable of fighting. Among them was the 80-gun battleship Wilhelm Tell, commanded by Admiral Vinov, 2 more battleships, and 2 frigates. However, at 11 a.m., Vinov cut the cables, hoisted sails, and headed north. As a result, 2 battleships and 2 frigates managed to escape from Aboukir Bay. The remaining ships in the rear guard, unable to gain speed, were set ablaze by their own crews. Later, as his justification, Vinov claimed that the wind was against him, and Brues did not give him orders to counterattack the British fleet. Thus, the battle ended in a complete rout. The French lost about 4,000 men as killed and wounded, with an additional 3,000 taken as POWs. 2 battleships of the line and 2 frigates were completely destroyed. The English captured 9 ships. Feeding and caring for such a large number of prisoners proved beyond Admiral Nelson's capability, and within a few days, everyone except 200 officers were returned to the shore. British losses amounted to 895 men, including the death of Captain Westcott. While Nelson's fleet didn't lose any ships, all the battleships sustained significant damage. 2 weeks after the battle, Nelson left Aboukir Bay and headed to Naples. Near Alexandria, he left 3 battleships of the line for patrolling. The consequences of the Battle of Abukir were immense. Bonaparte's army was trapped, and they could rely only on its own strength. Moreover, the previously indecisive Ottoman Empire declared war on France, and now Bonaparte was to fight with more than the Mamluks. The first news of the Abukir disaster reached Cairo on August 14th. Bonaparte was stunned by this news, and after reading the battle report, he sorrowfully remarked, "Unfortunate Brues, what have you done?" The Aboukir disaster seriously impacted the course of the campaign. With no possibility of receiving reinforcements, the French found themselves trapped, surrounded by enemies on all sides. However, Bonaparte did not give up. The energy and determination with which he set out to strengthen his position in Egypt quickly made everyone forget about the loss of the fleet. Large-scale reforms and the establishment of various institutions accompanied the first months of our stay in Egypt. The finest quality flour, obtainable in Paris, was ground in mills built in Alexandria, Rosetta, and Cairo. Our food consisted of excellent bread, meat, rice, peas, and a small amount of coffee as a substitute for alcoholic beverages, which were unknown in Egypt before our arrival. In addition, powder mills, foundries, and large workshops for gunsmiths, carpenters, and joiners were built. Thanks to the efforts of citizen Leray, full-fledged hospitals were established, with each patient allocated a bed. For organizing these vital institutions, Leray earned the respect of the commander-in-chief and the gratitude of the entire army. The French achieved such results in just a couple of months. Bonaparte also improved the urban governance system, resulting in the sheikhs of Cairo gaining significant privileges and powers. The sheikhs were amazed that the victory of the unbelievers, which they had feared so much, provided them with better conditions than they had under the Mamluks. All these measures quickly attracted the local population to the side of the French, and everything developed with unimaginable activity. However, Bonaparte's greatest achievement, which proved valuable for centuries, was the establishment of the Egyptian Institute, consisting of 4 sections: mathematics, physics, natural sciences, and arts. The Institute's main goal was to spread knowledge and enlightenment in Egypt. In addition to their work at the Institute, scientists studied the great monuments of antiquity, treating them with great caution. Their greatest achievement would be the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, thanks to which it would become possible to decipher ancient Egyptian writings in the future. Meanwhile, the army was not idle. On August 10th, Dugua's division captured Damietta. On August 14th, near the village of El Salahi, French cavalry defeated the Mamluks of Ibrahim Bay in a fierce battle, completely driving them out of Egypt. Thus, by the beginning of September, the entirety of Lower Egypt was under full control. As a result, Bonaparte's situation was not as hopeless as it might have seemed after the Battle of Abukir. After defeating Ibrahim Bay, Bonaparte sent a letter urging him to cease resistance and join the French side. Moreover, he and all his Mamluks were offered the right to retain ownership of all their villages and houses. They were also guaranteed a decent salary paid by the Republic. A similar offer was made to Murad Bey. Bonaparte offered him the position of governor of the Upper Egyptian provinces. Initially, the Mamluks pondered Bonaparte's proposals, but after learning about the destruction of the French fleet, they rejected all offers, thinking that the French were now doomed. Failing to reach a compromise with the Mamluks, Bonaparte instructed General Dese to drive Murad Bey out of Upper Egypt completely. On August 25th, Dese's division, consisting of 2,700 men and 2 cannons, moved south and occupied the village of Fayoum, where the French discovered a magnificent oasis with lakes, canals, and fertile fields. The French then continued their march, and on October 7th, near Sedimon, Dese defeated Murad Bey's cavalry in a fierce battle and forced him to retreat even further south. However, pursuing the Mamluks without cavalry and with such insignificant infantry was impossible. Moreover, due to the bright sun and constant dust, soldiers began to suffer from ophthalmia en masse, leading to temporary blindness. In this situation, Dese, who also temporarily lost his sight, returned to Fayoum to replenish his ranks and restore their health before continuing the campaign. Thus began the legendary campaign of General Dese, which lasted 9 months. Pursuing Murad Bey, the French will undertake numerous marches, totaling an estimated 500 miles. By the end of the campaign, the division of this outstanding French general will reach the very cataracts of the Nile and visit breathtaking places. Meanwhile, a new threat loomed over the French once again. Sultan Selim III of the Ottoman Empire declared war on France and issued a decree calling all his subjects to take up arms and begin a holy war against the French. And it wasn't just a threat. As soon as news of this reached Cairo, the inhabitants, incited by their religious leaders, unexpectedly revolted. On the same day, the killing of Frenchmen began throughout the city. Also, the enraged crowd stormed the Institute building and killed several employees. It was too late to resolve this peacefully. As a result, troops were raised on alarm, and from October 21st to 22nd, heavy and merciless battles raged throughout the city. The uprising cost the French the lives of 300 soldiers. Also, one of Napoleon's most talented adjutants, Joseph Sulkowski, died a horrible death. Thus, the uprising in Cairo was brutally suppressed, and soon order and tranquility were restored in the city. However, the threat of the Ottoman armies advancing from the east became increasingly apparent with each passing day. Initially, the expedition plan foresaw that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the French Republic, Talleyrand, would go to Constantinople to explain the French goals to the Sultan and reach a compromise regarding Egypt. However, Talleyrand had no intention of leaving Paris. After the Battle of Abukir, the government also lost interest in Egypt. In these circumstances, Bonaparte had to rethink for himself how to confront an entire empire with a 30,000-strong army. By the end of the autumn of 1798, Bonaparte knew that the Sultan was actively mobilizing his forces to advance on Egypt from two directions. The army of the Damascus Pasha was supposed to advance through the Sinai Desert. The Second Ottoman Army planned to cross the sea on British ships and land in Damietta or Abukir. While these armies were being formed, the ruler of Acre, Djezzar Pasha, who earned the nickname the Butcher for his cruelty, was supposed to approach the border with Egypt and occupy the border forts. Djezzar's troops were to be supported by the Mamluks. In total, over 50,000 warriors were supposed to attack the 30,000-strong French army from different directions. However, Bonaparte had no plans to sit back in passive defense and watch for the Sultan to gather all his armies. He decided to make a swift march through the Sinai Desert with 3 divisions and launch a decisive counterattack against the forces advancing on Egypt. The task was to capture all the fortresses controlling the coastline and crush the armies of Djezzar and the Damascus Pasha before the Sultan's second army landed on the coast. Achieving this goal was extremely difficult, especially since Bonaparte could deploy just over 13,000 men for the campaign in Syria, which was half as many as the enemy could gather in Syria. Nevertheless, Bonaparte had battle-hardened, brave soldiers who, by this time, had already adapted to the country and its climate. Moreover, the French already had enough excellent horses at their disposal to form full-fledged cavalry units. Dizay's divisions were tasked with continuing to pursue Murad Bey in Upper Egypt. The rest of the troops remained to cover Lower Egypt and Cairo. So, while Dizay, supported by Davout's cavalry, pursued Murad Bey, Bonaparte began to concentrate divisions for the campaign in Syria. On February 6, 1799, French divisions set out to the east. A few days after the march began, the French saw before them the sturdy stone fortress of El Arish, defended by about 2,500 Ottoman infantrymen. Regnier's division, which was in the vanguard, immediately launched an assault on this fortress, but the attack was repelled, and Regnier suffered considerable losses. The subsequent attack by Kleber's division also did not succeed. The enemy infantry showed unexpected tenacity and resilience. Only on February 19th, when General Daumartin gathered all available mortars and conducted a massive bombardment of the fort, the defenders declared their readiness to surrender. As a result, the fortress of El Arish was surrendered to the French. The remaining 900 Ottoman infantrymen, after swearing that they would no longer fight against the French, were released. The capture of this fortress cost Bonaparte 11 precious days, and this unforeseen delay would have tremendous significance in the future. Leaving a small garrison in El Arish, the French army resumed its march. Next, they faced the challenging crossing to Gaza. However, the French already had experience with such marches, and this time they were much better prepared. The soldiers had spare water flasks, and numerous camels were used to transport supplies. In addition, provisions were made for medical assistance and the transportation of field artillery. The siege artillery was transported by light vessels by sea. Thus, the French made this march without serious losses, and on February 25th, Napoleon's troops occupied Gaza without encountering any resistance. The Gaza plain was covered with groves of olive trees and numerous streams, and the French enjoyed a brief rest in this rather cozy place. Moreover, on this day, thunder suddenly sounded and the long-awaited rain began. While in Gaza, both soldiers and scholars were seized with a burning desire to visit the sacred city, Jerusalem. However, these proposals were rejected by the commander-in-chief, and 2 days later, French vanguards approached the city of Jaffa, where a garrison of 4,000 enemy troops was stationed. About 8,000 inhabitants lived in Jaffa. The city had a port that the English could use, so seizing it was extremely important. In the early morning of March 7th, after preliminary siege preparations, 2 French officers were sent to the city's commandant, Abdallah, with an offer to surrender the city without a fight on honorable terms. The French envoys were received cordially, but a quarter of an hour later, the army was horrified to see their heads impaled on spikes displayed on the 2 largest towers, and their bodies were thrown from the walls so the French could see everything. Abdallah hoped to intimidate his enemy in this way, but it had the opposite effect. Upon seeing the decapitated and mutilated bodies of their comrades in arms, the French boiled with rage, and moments later, artillery began pounding the walls from all guns. Meanwhile, consumed by fury, General Lannes formed the 22nd Infantry Regiment into a column and eagerly awaited the moment to storm. A powerful bombardment of the walls lasted for 5 hours, and around 3 p.m. the first breach was made. Despite the breach not being wide enough yet, Lannes resolutely launched the attack on Abdallah's thugs. The brutality of this clash was extreme, with no mercy shown on either side. Abdallah directed almost all of his warriors to defend the breach, but Murat arrived in time to assist Lannes. Meanwhile, Bond's division, which was conducting diversionary actions, accidentally discovered a hidden passage in the wall. The division immediately rushed there and broke into Jaffa. The news that Bond's division was in the city further emboldened the soldiers. Napoleon immediately deployed additional reserves into battle, and caught between 2 fires, the enemy infantry began to retreat and seek shelter in the houses. Then, one of the most horrifying episodes of this campaign occurred. The French army, which previously demonstrated almost exemplary discipline, completely lost control. Soldiers, seized by mad rage and thirst for revenge, began to smash and cut down everything in their paths. Napoleon immediately sent his adjutants into the city to stop the slaughter, but all was in vain. The troops were uncontrollable, and for 20 hours, Jaffa experienced all the horrors of a stormed city. Only at dawn did everything calm down, and the adjutants sent into the city discovered that several thousand surviving enemy soldiers had barricaded themselves in the fortress. They declared that they were ready to surrender on the condition that they would be spared. One of Napoleon's adjutants, Eugène du Beauharnais, agreed to their terms. However, unwittingly, Napoleon's adjutants created a dreadful situation, and after huge columns of prisoners were brought to the commander-in-chief, everyone realized the gravity of the situation. "What do you want me to do with so many prisoners? Do I have provisions to feed them, ships to transport them? Damn it, what am I to do with them?" Among the prisoners, the French found many men who had sworn in El Arish not to fight against the French. After this, it became apparent that the prisoners could not be released anymore, as they would inevitably turn back to Djezzar's side and take up arms. To address this issue, Napoleon convened a military council attended by all divisional generals. The French believed that the food shortage and the small number of troops did not allow them either to convoy the prisoners to the rear or to feed them. In this situation, the council unanimously passed a terrible verdict. It was decided that there was no other option but to execute the prisoners by shooting them. On March 10th, on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea, this decision was carried out. I was a witness to a scene that still makes me shudder when I think about it, and I would prefer to have the opportunity to forget it rather than be forced to describe it. I was present at all the debates, all the councils, and all the discussions, and I am deeply convinced that Napoleon made his decision based on the opinion of the committee, the opinion of which ultimately proved to be unanimous. I must also say that he made this decision under the pressure of exceptional circumstances. I told the truth, the whole truth. It will be up to future generations to judge whether the terrible situation in which Napoleon found himself was hopeless. Abdallah was luckier than his soldiers. He hid and disguised himself in the attire of one of the monks of the custody of the Holy Land, after which he left Jaffa, made his way to the commander-in-chief's tent, and fell to his knees before him. Abdallah was treated as well as he could have wished. The French obtained the necessary information from him and sent him to Cairo. However, the horrors of Jaffa were only just beginning. Not even 2 days passed before the soldiers began to exhibit strange, acute symptoms. Soon after examining the sick, the chief surgeon of the army, Larrey, without concealing his concerns, announced a shocking conclusion to the commander-in-chief. An outbreak of bubonic plague had begun in the French army. This terrible, deadly disease was resistant to any treatment, and panic immediately ensued in the army. The bubonic plague was rapidly spreading throughout Jaffa, and the number of sick increased with each passing day. The French army in this campaign had never been so close to perishing. Larrey, Desjeunet, and other doctors made incredible efforts to prevent the spread of the disease. Soldiers were ordered to burn all seized items indiscriminately during the looting of the city, and doctors recommended complete isolation for those afflicted with the plague. Dr. Desjeunet knew well the disease he was dealing with, but wisely insisted on concealing its true name from the army. However, despite his efforts, these endeavors became futile after a few days. The terrified city dwellers hid in their homes and refused to interact with the French. Shortly thereafter, the medics began deserting. Fear gripped the entire army. General Bonaparte made a move comparable in risk to storming the bridge at Arcole to counteract the spread of disorganization and panic. On March 11, 1799, General Bonaparte, accompanied by his staff, deemed it his duty to visit the hospital. The general traversed the entire hospital and its annex, conversing with almost all the soldiers who were conscious enough to hear him, and for an hour and a half, with the greatest composure, attended to the details of management. In a very small and overcrowded ward, he helped lift, or rather carry, the dreadful corpse of a soldier whose torn uniform was stained with a burst, draining bubo. The commander-in-chief's action had an excellent effect. Panic in the army ceased, and among the soldiers, a rumor quickly spread that the plague only struck those who feared it. So, after visiting the hospital, Bonaparte ordered the army to move forward. On March 14th, the French troops left Jaffa, and just a few days later, after overcoming minor resistance, entered Haifa, seizing large food warehouses that the enemy had not had time to evacuate. As the French approached Acre, a dreadful fear gripped Djezzar's troops and the city residents, as they were well aware of the fate of the Jaffa garrison. Djezzar Pasha himself seriously contemplated evacuating from Acre by ship in those days, but unexpected help came to him. On March 18th, while on Mount Carmel, the commander-in-chief noticed 2 British 80-gun ships commanded by Commodore Sir Sidney Smith standing in the roadstead of Acre. They had arrived in the roadstead of Acre from Constantinople just 2 days ago. The arrival of the British fleet somewhat reassured Djezzar and his warriors. Moreover, on board the British battleship was an extremely talented engineering officer who could help Djezzar organize an effective defense. This was Antoine Lupicard du Villepot, a French officer and royalist supporter who had fought on the side of the coalition against the Republic. Ironically, he was a classmate of Bonaparte's at the Paris Military School. They sat at the same desk during their studies. Furthermore, during these days, another fateful event would significantly affect the course of the siege. The French fleet carrying siege artillery did not receive timely information that British battleships were on course due to an unfortunate accident. As a result, the English captured almost the entire fleet with siege artillery on board. Thus, if not for the delay in El Arish, Bonaparte would have reached Acre before the English fleet arrived, and Acre would undoubtedly have fallen within a few days. However, Bonaparte did not consider the loss of the siege park a critical circumstance. After the successful storming of Jaffa, the French believed they would take Acre even with field artillery. On March 19th, the French approached the city walls. About 12,000 people lived in Acre. The garrison consisted of about 5,000 soldiers and 250 guns with huge stocks of gunpowder. Acre's main fortifications and walls were built during the Crusades and, despite their dilapidated appearance, were quite strong. However, the most important thing for Gisard was that British battleships were in Acre's roadstead, which allowed supplies and reinforcements to be delivered unhindered. On the night of March 19th to 20th, the French conducted a reconnaissance of Acre's fortifications. However, the engineering officer couldn't thoroughly inspect the fortifications due to heavy gunfire from the top of the walls. Nevertheless, he reported that the walls of Acre were no stronger than those in Jaffa, and that the ditch he discovered along the walls was shallow. Ultimately, the conclusion was drawn that the city could be taken by a bold attack. To attack Acre, trenches needed to be dug from the siege camp to the walls to shield the attackers from the defenders' crossfire. Additionally, this would allow the French to plant mines under the walls or towers. Active preparations for the assault went on over the following week. It was decided to concentrate the attacking efforts where the walls formed a corner and were closest to the French. In the first wave of the assault, 2 companies of the bravest carabineers were to go, supported by a detachment of sappers. This assault unit had ladders and fascines prepared to fill the ditch. Staff Officer Chateau Renaud was to lead the carabineers in the assault. Then the main forces of Kleber's and Regnier's divisions were to follow through the breach. Bond's and Land's divisions remained in reserve. So, at dawn on March 28th, the French field artillery opened fire. At that moment, true terror gripped the defenders of Acre. Some had already abandoned their positions and fled, and Gisard was already aboard the ship with all his belongings at this time. Finally, around 4 p.m., a part of the tower collapsed amidst the enthusiastic French cries. After this, Chateau Renaud led the carabineers in the assault.
En avant!
However, as the French approached the walls, they discovered that the ditch was much deeper than anticipated, and the fascines became utterly useless. Moreover, the ditch had a counterscarp. Yet, Chateau Renaud did not retreat. Despite the hail of fire, soldiers with ladders attempted to overcome the ditch, but many of them, upon jumping down, couldn't climb back up. After finding themselves trapped, Gisard's infantry quickly shot them. In the end, almost the entire vanguard of the storming column perished. The dead included Chateau Renaud and several colonels. Thus, the first assault failed, significantly altering the morale of Acre's defenders. Following barbaric customs, Gisard established a generous reward for every severed head of a French soldier brought to him. At the same time, Sidney Smith promptly landed 800 English soldiers to reinforce Gisard's garrison, while Colonel Philippot worked day and night on fortifications and essentially directed the entire defense. He decided not just to focus on repelling French attacks, but to conduct active defense involving regular sorties and counterattacks. Supplies of gunpowder, provisions, and the ability to replenish the garrison greatly contributed to this plan. And just a few days after the first assault, the besieged launched a sortie. Under the cover of continuous artillery fire, several thousand Arabs attacked the French trenches. Bonaparte promptly ordered the 32nd Demi Brigade to launch a counterattack. This formidable Demi Brigade swiftly repelled the enemy infantry back into the fortress with a bayonet attack. The next day, the French attempted to capitalize on their success. By this time, the ditch was partially filled with stones, and after the explosion of another mine, Divisional General Kleber led the assault with 6 grenadier companies.
Bataillon, marche!
However, once again, the crossfire from the top of the walls was so powerful and intense that the assault ended in a bloodbath. Nearly all who participated were wounded or killed. By this point, it became apparent that until siege artillery arrived and full trenches were dug, attempts at storming would only result in heavy losses. Thus, it was decided to halt the attacks and prepare for the assault more thoroughly. Meanwhile, despite constant fighting in the trenches, soldiers in the siege camp felt excellent. Christians from all nearby towns and villages gathered at the French camp. They offered various goods for sale, and the French had no problems with water, provisions, or spirits. With each passing day, our camp resembles a country fair more and more. Wine, spirits, figs, wheat cakes, grapes, oil, and so on. Everything is in abundance here, albeit at sky-high prices. But during the campaign, pennies aren't counted. In addition, various delegations from Nazareth, Jerusalem, and other cities visited the French camp. They all complained about the cruelty and abuses of Djezzar and expressed support for Bonaparte. All the Syrians hate Djezzar. There is no torture he has not inflicted on the Christians, as well as on the Muslims of Syria, and even on his most faithful followers. He has cut the noses and ears off some, blinded and maimed others, or shod them like horses. Thus, Bonaparte had substantial grounds to believe that at least a significant portion of the Syrian population, especially the Druze and Christians whom Djezzar occasionally killed, would support him against Ottoman rule. Meanwhile, the siege works continued. The trenches dug by the French had already reached close to the walls, allowing them to take cover from enemy fire. However, preparation for the decisive assault had to be interrupted again due to a new threat. Information had been received that a 30,000-strong army from Damascus had come out to aid Djezzar. These troops were already approaching the Jordan River, posing a real threat of encirclement to the French under the walls of Acre. The siege of Acre continued. In early April 1799, the army of the Damascus Pasha approached the Jordan River, making Napoleon's situation extremely perilous. With only 13,000 troops, he needed to besiege a garrison of 5,000 in Acre while repelling the advance of the 30,000-strong Damascus army. Despite the enemy's nearly threefold numerical superiority, Bonaparte decided not to retreat, but to engage the enemy as far from the siege camp as possible. However, realizing the threat to his rear, the commander-in-chief ordered the immediate evacuation of the infirmaries from Haifa to Jaffa. Meanwhile, the Damascus Pasha divided his forces into two groups. One, consisting of 8,000 men under his son's command, had already crossed the Jordan River and blockaded Safed citadel. The main force was advancing from the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee and was nearing Nazareth. In turn, Napoleon also took action, dispatching General Murat with a force of 1,000 men to Safed. Joachim Murat, the future legend of the French cavalry, was one of the bravest warriors in the army, undeterred by the size of the Damascus army. Exploiting the enemy's dispersed forces, Murat launched a series of swift, highly successful attacks. As a result, the surprised vanguard of the Damascus army was routed and pushed back across the Jordan River. Murat then executed a flanking maneuver and stormed Tiberias, capturing such a large quantity of enemy provisions that it could sustain the entire army for half a year. Thus, Murat successfully carried out the commander-in-chief's order, clearing the territory north of the Sea of Galilee. Meanwhile, Junot, with a reconnaissance squad of 450 men, acted just as decisively. He outpaced the enemy, seizing Nazareth first. However, near Nazareth, Junot encountered an enemy force outnumbering his own nearly sevenfold. On April 8, 1799, an extremely fierce battle took place at Nazareth, where Junot and his soldiers covered themselves in everlasting glory. For many hours, 450 French soldiers repelled the attacks of a 3,000-strong enemy force with the utmost courage. In the heat of battle, Junot personally engaged in saber combat with Murad Bey's son. While the outcome of this duel could have significantly influenced the battle's outcome, Junot emerged victorious. In the end, the French successfully repelled all attacks, maintaining control of Nazareth. Several days later, the enemy attempted to flank Junot, but Kleber's division arrived just in time, defeating another enemy force near Cana of Galilee on April 11th. Thus, with these counterattacks, Bonaparte stopped the advance of the Damascus army. However, further events took an unexpected turn. Without waiting for reinforcements, Kleber decided to capitalize on the success and launch a surprise night attack on the enemy camp, hoping to catch them off guard and cut off their retreat to Damascus. Kleber informed the commander-in-chief of his intentions only a few hours before the operation. The offensive began at night. Kleber was confident that his division would reach the planned positions for the attack by dawn. However, it quickly became apparent that the French general had overestimated his powers. The terrain was poorly surveyed, and in the darkness, the French needed much more time to execute the maneuver. The division reached the designated position only at dawn. The enemy camp was quickly alerted, and Kleber's troops were immediately discovered. Thus, the nocturnal attack failed, and all the advantages of surprise were lost. Moreover, due to insufficient reconnaissance, the enemy's numbers turned out to be much larger than Kleber had anticipated. Ahead of the 2,000-strong French division stood an almost 30,000-strong Damascus army. As a result, the French were quickly surrounded. Despite Kleber's plan failing, as a bold commander, he did everything expected of him. He immediately formed the troops into a square and began calmly repelling enemy attacks. The French fought continuously for 10 hours with little hope of success. By around 4 p.m., the situation became critical. Ammunition was running out, and the soldiers, suffering from thirst, were rapidly growing weary. We were so exhausted from thirst and fatigue that we couldn't even speak, but we kept fighting and gladly would have given all the bread we had for a few bullets and gunpowder. In desperation, Kleber decided to abandon the cannons and attempt to break through to the mountains. When the orders were given, soldiers informed the division commander that glints resembling the shine of bayonets in the sun had been seen to the north. Kleber attempted to verify their report by ascending to a favorable position, but saw nothing. Losing all hope, Kleber finally attempted to break through the mountains. However, it soon became clear that Kleber's soldiers had not been mistaken. The flashes spotted to the north were not an illusion. They were the glinting bayonets of Bond's division, which Napoleon was leading in a forced march toward Mount Tabor. Upon receiving a message from Kleber during the night, Napoleon saw the flaws in this plan and urgently headed towards Mount Tabor, as the defeat of Kleber's division could endanger the entire French army. Marching for more than 24 miles, Napoleon arrived with reserves at the battle's most critical moment. Behind the tall wheat, it was difficult to discern the troops. However, after a few minutes, the artillery salvos of Bond's division announced the arrival of reinforcements to their comrades in arms. The surrounded troops of Kleber rejoiced. In greeting, they raised their hats on the tips of their bayonets. Napoleon separated the division into 3 columns and directed them to attack.
En avant!
The 32nd and 18th Semi-Brigades attacked with their usual fearlessness. General Rampon, with his grenadiers, quickly routed the enemy camp and set all the tents ablaze. Meanwhile, Kleber's division also moved forward. They attacked Damascus's army from 2 sides. Confusion and terror quickly peaked among the enemy. The French pursued the fleeing remnants of the Damascus army until nightfall. Kleber's troops suffered 250 to 300 killed and wounded men. Conversely, Bond's division only lost 4 men. Thus, Napoleon turned what was almost certain defeat into a decisive victory, eliminating Damascus's threat. The Janissaries of Damascus joined forces with the cavalry of Jazar and the Mamluks of Ibrahim Bey. Crossing the Jordan with the intention of lifting the siege of Acre, they were completely defeated in battles near Nazareth, Cana, and at Mount Tabor. A large number of enemies remained on the battlefield. Most of their supplies with rich trophies were captured. Some of the fleeing were pursued by our troops and drowned in the Jordan. The rest continued to flee toward Damascus. On April 19th, Bonaparte returned to the Acre camp, and the siege works continued with even greater intensity. By this time, the French had dug a 3rd parallel just 30 feet from the walls of Acre. Furthermore, Vice Admiral Pea, with a small squadron consisting of 3 frigates, managed to deliver 24-pound guns from Java, as well as powder and projectiles, which the French dearly needed. Meanwhile, the besieged also made serious efforts to strengthen their position. By these days, the garrison of Acre had strengthened since the beginning of the siege. The English fleet was supplying the fortress with everything necessary for defense without hindrance. Nevertheless, despite the difficulties and constant fire from the walls, the French continued preparations for the assault. On April 25th, French sappers detonated another mine under a tower. After that, the siege artillery opened fire and the assault troops launched their attack. The only effect of the mine explosion was that it collapsed the corner of the tower. Our grenadiers boldly attacked the breach, although it was evident that it was impossible to break through it. The enemy, entrenched on the tops of the walls and towers, shot at our troops and bombarded them with shells. However, since nothing could turn our troops back, the Turks began throwing barrels filled with powder at us. Our soldiers choked on the endless explosions and suffered severe burns. The French attack launched on April 25th was repelled. However, after each unsuccessful assault, the French advanced even more energetically, showing remarkable courage. In the following days, there was a real slaughter at the walls of Acre. French assaults were followed by counterattacks from the besieged, whose courage did not wane either. This continued every day. The horror of this battle was exacerbated by the refusal of Jazar's troops to bury the fallen warriors. The French appealed several times to the besieged to establish a truce to bury the dead, but Jazar refused. All the forward trenches were littered with corpses, and the blazing sun turned it all into a gruesome sight. Soon, it became unbearable to be in the trenches. Despite everything, the French continued inching forward. The fighting in the trenches was so fierce that French soldiers even had to sharpen the bayonets' edges so that the Turks could not wrench the rifles from their hands. Eventually, after several days of fierce fighting, Jazar once again lost his composure and planned to leave the city. However, he was persuaded otherwise by Colonel Philippou. This French engineering officer spared no effort in fortifying the defenses. He worked around the clock, but soon succumbed to severe sunstroke and died. The decisive assault was scheduled for May 4th. By this time, the French had dug a tunnel under the counterscarp and placed a mine. This explosion was supposed to widen the breach significantly. Success seemed certain. However, during the night, something happened that the French completely did not expect from the besieged. The Acre sappers, under the guidance of English engineers, dug a counter-tunnel and defused the mine. As a result, the French had to dig a new tunnel to lay the mine, which delayed them for several days. They assumed that the assault would take place on May 9th. However, luck smiled again on the besieged. On May 7th, 40 Turkish ships appeared on the horizon, transporting significant reinforcements to Acre. For Djezzar, who was convinced that Acre would be taken any day, this was a real salvation. It became clear to the French that they needed to assault the fortress immediately. Otherwise, after the arrival of enemy reinforcements, there would be no chance of taking the fortress. As a result, Bonaparte decided to attack right away, and the French opened fire with maximum intensity. 3 assault columns were supposed to go into the decisive attack. The first was led by General Ramboud, the second by General Lascalle, and at the head of the central column was the future Marshal of France, Jean Lannes. These troops were to be supported by the Bonne and Régnier divisions. At dawn on May 8th, drums sounded and Lannes' assault columns rushed into the decisive attack. Acre's first line of defense was breached immediately. The French seized the lodgment of the tower and the walls. Next, General Ramboud broke through the fortifications of the second line and penetrated the city straight to Djezzar's palace. Neither the desperation of the enemy's resistance nor the fierce fire of its artillery batteries stopped their advance. Generals Bonne, Vial, and Rampon led semi-brigades. Soldiers had never shown such courage and bravery before. For a moment, it seemed that the city would be taken, but at this critical moment for the besieged, long-awaited reinforcements arrived. They were sent straight into battle from the ships. Furthermore, Sidney Smith once again withdrew his crews and sent them to help Djezzar. All day and night, a terrible slaughter raged in Acre. The situation had now become dire for the French. 2 companies led by General Ramboud were isolated in the city, and after their ammunition ran out, these brave men were killed with bayonets. Lannes was wounded in the neck, and he narrowly escaped falling into the hands of the Turks, but the general was saved by his adjutants. The Turks also killed several English officers whom they mistook for Frenchmen in the darkness, but Sidney Smith magnanimously ignored this incident. As a result, over 20 hours of continuous battle, the French had to abandon the part of the city they had occupied. But the battle did not end there. At dawn, Djezzar's forces, strengthened by the arrival of reinforcements, launched a massive sortie. Over 5,000 warriors participated in this attack. They once again seized the wall's remnants and managed to break through to the third trench, but soon the French surrounded the enemy unit and nearly routed them. Inspired by this success, Napoleon's divisions launched another attack on May 10th, and another slaughter occurred in Acre. The generals were so heated by the battle that no one counted the losses anymore. Everyone stormed in, and no one stayed behind in the rear. Division commanders fought on the front lines, setting an example of courage and coolness. On this day, 17 officers were killed. Divisional General Louis-André Bonne received a mortal wound. Kleber heroically fought in the front lines. Even Murat climbed Acre's walls. However, by the end of the day, it became clear that bravery alone wouldn't be enough to capture Acre, and the commander-in-chief finally decided to end this slaughter and lift the siege. The lifting of the siege was disguised as an increase in fire. All artillery continuously fired for 4 days and leveled all Acre's remaining fortifications. Meanwhile, the French prepared to return to Egypt. The commander-in-chief's main concern in those days was evacuating the wounded. By his order, everyone able to walk, regardless of rank, had to go on foot. All horses, mules, camels, and donkeys were to be used exclusively for transporting the severely wounded. We needed to carry 1,200 wounded and sick with us. All the rest, cannons of all calibers, mortars, shells, bombs, muskets, bullets, in short, almost all artillery weapons had to be buried in the fields and on the beach. We also blew up the remaining gunpowder. By May 20th, everything was ready for our departure. But the enemy made an active sortie. It lasted almost all day. The fire was terrible. The enemy fiercely rushed into our trenches, but the Régnier division continued to push them back with great losses. So, on the evening of May 20th, the French army set off along the seashore, but this time toward Egypt. The siege of Acre lasted 62 days. At the beginning of the siege, Bonaparte had 13,000 men at his disposal. During the siege, 500 men were killed, including some outstanding officers. The army's heaviest loss was the death of the highly respected and esteemed General Caffarelli. Also, 2,500 men were wounded. Of these, 800 returned to duty, while 700 died in hospitals. The losses of Djezzar's army amounted to about 10,000 killed, wounded, and captured. Mostly, these losses were incurred in endless sorties, which ended fatally for the besieged. Despite having to leave Syria, Napoleon achieved one significant result. The enemy armies, gathered with such difficulty, were defeated, and they could no longer threaten Egypt. Soldiers, you crossed the desert separating Africa from Asia faster than any army consisting of Arabs could. The army marching towards Egypt was destroyed. You captured the fortresses guarding the desert wells. You scattered on the plain below Mount Tabor the hordes gathered from all corners of Asia in hopes of plundering Egypt. Finally, after leading war for 3 months in the heart of Syria with a handful of men, we captured 40 cannons, 50 standards, and 6,000 prisoners, leveled the fortifications of Gaza, Jaffa, Haifa, and Acre, and we are about to return to Egypt. Soldiers, new difficulties and dangers await us. You will find in them new opportunities for glory. We have deprived the East of the ability to do anything against us during this campaign, but we may have to repel attacks from the West. After a grueling and bloody siege, the French army left Syria. At the walls of Acre, Bonaparte's soldiers demonstrated the utmost bravery. However, they now had to demonstrate the limits of their endurance as the scorching June sun-drenched desert lay ahead of them. The troops marched on foot, as all the horses and camels, without exception, were given to transport the wounded. The commander-in-chief, all the staff's officers, and all the generals also marched on foot, sharing the hardships equally with the soldiers. On May 21st, the army headed towards Egypt. Soldiers, weakened by disease and fatigue, were forced to carry their wounded brothers in turn. The heat was already very intense and gradually increasing. We followed the seashore and passed through Caesarea. I was very interested to learn about this ancient city. Our time in Jaffa was less pleasant. The city was half ruined and practically abandoned. All our sick and wounded filled the hospitals, ports, and streets. I witnessed the most heart-wrenching scenes. When Bonaparte arrived in Jaffa, he was informed that there were 25 patients heavily stricken with plague in the hospital, and they could not be evacuated. The medical commission confirmed that the patients were in a terminal state and were not transportable. In this situation, Bonaparte faced the dreadful necessity of deciding the fate of those who could not continue and for whom evacuating was impossible. After consulting with the doctors, the commander-in-chief proposed to ease the suffering of the hopelessly ill and give them opium so that the unfortunate could pass away without suffering and avoid the risk of being tortured by the Turks. The doctors' opinions were divided. The chief army officer, Desjeunet, refused, stating that his duty was to give the sick only what could cure them. Other doctors admitted this grim and inevitable necessity. I am aware that there are many distorted accounts of this matter. As for me, I am stating what I believed to be true then and what I believe to be true now. I cannot say that I saw anyone administering opium with my own eyes to the plague-stricken. I would be lying. However, I know that such a decision was made, that the order was given, and that the plague victims died. After leaving Jaffa, it took the French another 9 agonizing days to reach Egypt. When the exhausted soldiers saw Cairo, they felt the same satisfaction they would have felt upon seeing their homeland. On June 14th, Bonaparte entered Cairo. To dispel the rumors spread by enemies that the French had been defeated in Syria and also recognize the importance of propaganda, the French triumphantly organized their entry into the capital. Their path was strewn with palm leaves, captured enemy banners were carried at the front, and the orchestra played victory marches. Meanwhile, the enemy prepared for a new battle. The outcome of the siege of Acre had infatuated the British Commodore, Sir Sidney Smith. He believed that Bonaparte's army had suffered irreparable losses in Syria, and he actively persuaded the Turks to urgently send another army to Egypt to finish off the French. With an army of 25,000 men, you can cover yourself with immortal glory, for the French army is self-destroyed, very dissatisfied, demoralized, and ready to revolt. It has suffered huge losses from the fire of British ships of the line and frigates. Its losses from the desert crossing in the June heat were no less significant. Bonaparte was aware of the impending landing. It was expected that the Turks would attempt to land an army in Damietta or Abukir. In addition, there were substantial reasons to believe that British troops would land along with the Turks. Therefore, upon returning to Cairo, Bonaparte immediately began preparing for a new battle. The regiments replenished their losses with a large number of men from the garrisons and those discharged from hospitals. The cavalry also set about replenishing its ranks. Part of the troops was transferred from Upper Egypt. Bonaparte took all possible measures to make up for the losses, and by early July, the French army had rested and the conditions of the troops had significantly improved. Egypt seems to us like another France, a second home. Our harsh memories are already fading. We have returned to our friends and comrades, and past sufferings are already forgotten. However, besides the enemy's planned landing, Bonaparte knew something else. Even during the siege of Acre, the commander-in-chief received information from various sources that a new coalition had formed against France, even more powerful than the first one. It was not difficult for Bonaparte to speculate about the situation in France. The corrupt and disrespected Directory was unable to unite the nation to fight the coalition. If the French troops on the main front failed, Egypt would no longer matter, and the army stationed here would be doomed. Nevertheless, despite the alarming news from France, Bonaparte continued to actively strengthen his position in Egypt. Fortification works were energetically carried out in the fortresses and on the coast. Navigation on the Nile was improved. In addition, the work of the Institute continued actively. Among other things, scientists studied the causes of the plague. They were also working on a project for the construction of the Suez Canal. On July 15th, Bonaparte, along with the scientists, visited the pyramids of Cheops, and on this very day at 2 p.m., he received the news that 80 transport ships, escorted by British ships of the line, had anchored in the Bay of Abukir. He was also informed that Turkish troops, commanded by Mustafa Pasha, had already captured the coastal fortifications, killing 300 defenders. Although this news reached Bonaparte when he was not in Cairo, it did not come as a surprise to him. 3 days later, he was already in Romania, 80 miles to the north, where he was concentrating his strike forces. The speed and precision of execution were incredible. The entire army was set in motion. It took Bonaparte only 9 days to gather the troops scattered throughout Egypt and to move them to Abukir. Mustafa Pasha primarily intended to establish a powerful fortified beachhead near Abukir and take a defensive position, in which the Turks had much greater advantages than in the offensive. At that moment, the Ottoman army numbered about 13,000 warriors. Having secured the coast, Mustafa Pasha was awaiting the arrival of another Janissary division and cavalry. Only after that did he plan to move further. Therefore, such a rapid concentration of French troops disrupted all the Turks' plans. Moreover, the position chosen by the Ottoman commander could be considered strong if he were to fight, for example, with the Mamluk army. However, the Turks faced the best army in Europe, and it was not in the terrible condition the British mistakenly believed. These were the same heroes of the battles of Castiglione, Arcole, and Rivoli. By July 24th, to Mustafa Pasha's great surprise, the French army was in the vicinity of Abukir. At dawn the next day, Bonaparte's army deployed in battle order. Murat's cavalry took the center, Destain's brigade was on the left, Lannes' division was on the right, and Linus was in reserve. 15 cannons were distributed along the front. At this moment, Bonaparte had about 8,000 men. Kleber's division was still on the march. They expected to arrive in the afternoon. The Ottoman troops had by this time managed to construct 2 defensive lines, which were covered by redoubts. A detachment of 5,000 men defended the first line. The second line of defense housed 7,000 men. Mustafa Pasha had 30 cannons. Gunboats were stationed in the open sea, supporting the flanks of this position. Sidney Smith, with a small number of British officers, was also on hand and served as the Pasha's deputy. Finally, the French artillery opened fire from all their cannons. The cannonade lasted 2 hours. Then Bonaparte, with the forces of 2 divisions, launched a massive attack on the first defensive line. Along with the infantry attack, the cavalry moved forward. The French acted decisively and in unison, which could not be said of the Ottoman troops. Destain's and Lannes' infantry attacked the front redoubts, while Murat's squadrons penetrated through the gaps in the fortifications and flanked the enemy from behind. Mustafa Pasha did not dare to counterattack with reserves to support the troops in the first line. As a result, the Turks were caught between the cavalry and infantry, and after a brief fight, the defense was broken. Deprived of the possibility to retreat, they had no choice but to plunge into the sea. Having overcome the first line of defense, the French moved forward and attacked the central redoubt of the second line, but here they encountered more serious resistance. The entire tip of the peninsula turned into a field of slaughter, disorder, and confusion, which further disrupted the already weak discipline of the Ottoman troops. Nevertheless, the Turks held their ground bravely. Mustafa Pasha concentrated all his forces in the center to hold land, but he failed to notice that the left flank was left unprotected. To the Turks' misfortune, Murat noticed this, and within minutes, 900 cavalrymen in tight squadrons launched an attack.
Sabre à la main!
Murat's attack was so unexpected and vigorous that the Turks had no time to respond. In a matter of minutes, the French cavalry crushed the enemy's flank. Then Murat rushed straight to the tent of the Ottoman commander-in-chief. Mustafa Pasha did not lose his composure. He managed to fire a pistol shot directly at the French general's head. But Murat was lucky. The bullet entered one cheek and exited through the other without hitting any bone or damaging any teeth. In the next second, Murat struck with his saber, severing several fingers on Mustafa Pasha's hand, after which he captured him. From this moment, the battle descended into chaos. The remaining Turkish troops, gripped by terror, fled and plunged into the sea, attempting to swim to the ships, but only a few managed to do so. Sir Sidney Smith also narrowly evaded capture and barely made it to his boat. In Fort Abukir, around 2,500 Turks continued to resist. Bonaparte addressed the garrison, promising them safe passage to the Turkish ships in case of surrender. Initially, however, the Turks refused to capitulate. They held out for a week, despite the most incredible hardships. Yet, on August 2nd, driven mad by thirst, they finally emerged. They looked like ghosts. They came out of the fort, bowed, and asked for death. But our commanders and soldiers, forgetting their previous hatred for the enemy, felt compassion for them, caused by their terrible condition. We gave them water and food. The Turks ate so ravenously that 400 of them died from indigestion before they could be evacuated to Alexandria. Thus, the 13,000-strong Ottoman army ceased to exist. French losses did not exceed 1,000 killed and wounded. After the battle, Bonaparte sent 2 officers aboard the British flagship to arrange a prisoner exchange. The ever-polite Sir Sidney Smith handed the French 2 sets of European newspapers. In them, Bonaparte read the news up to June 10th, and his grim suspicions were confirmed. On all fronts, France was on the verge of catastrophe. The French had been driven out of Germany by Archduke Charles and out of Italy by Suvorov. The Cisalpine Republic had been dissolved. Mantua was under siege. The government was lurching from one political and economic crisis to another, with the likely prospect of the Republic's complete overthrow. The situation in France was so desperate that the Directory had even decided to bring Bonaparte back from Egypt. Thanks to Admiral Bruy successfully relocating the fleet from Brest to Toulon, the French temporarily gained an advantage in the Mediterranean. Moreover, the Allied Spanish fleet had also joined the French squadron in Toulon. In total, Bruy had 46 ships of the line and could confidently dominate the Mediterranean for 3 months. This was more than enough time to evacuate part of the forces from Egypt. You yourself, Citizen General, can judge whether you can safely leave part of your forces, and the Directory authorizes you, in that case, to entrust your command to whomever you deem necessary. Nevertheless, the Directory still lacked the courage to do this, and the chance to control the Mediterranean was lost. However, Bonaparte had not been counting on it. After receiving the latest news about the state of the Republic, he decided once again to trust his luck and leave Egypt on his own, despite the risk of being captured by the British. The preparations for this were carried out in the utmost secrecy. Only a few people knew about the commander-in-chief's plans, and within 2 weeks, 2 frigates were ready in the port of Alexandria. Before leaving Egypt, Bonaparte prepared detailed instructions for General Kleber, who was to take over as commander-in-chief, on further actions. Bonaparte's decision sparked mixed reactions throughout the army. Some considered it the only way out of the situation, while others expressed bewilderment and condemnation. The greatest outrage was voiced by Kleber, who was burdened with the responsibility of commander-in-chief. Soldiers, the news from Europe has compelled me to return to France. I am leaving General Kleber in command of the army. You will soon receive news from me. It pains me to leave the soldiers I love, but this absence will only be temporary. The commander I am leaving in charge has the confidence of the government and mine. On August 22nd, at 9 p.m., 2 frigates set sail from the shores of Egypt. The commander-in-chief, the chief of staff, some scientists, and aides departed on the frigate named Muiron. This frigate was named in honor of the adjutant who was killed in the Battle of Arcole, covering the commander-in-chief with his own body. Generals Lannes, Murat, and Marmont sailed on another frigate. The route was laid along the African coast, and luck was once again on Bonaparte's side. The voyage was relatively smooth and lasted 47 days. In the first week of October, due to a severe storm, the French had to make a brief stop in Ajaccio. Finally, on October 8, 1799, after narrowly avoiding a confrontation with Lord Keith's British fleet, the frigates approached French shores. On October 8th, we were already in the harbor of Fréjus and preparing to land when word spread that General Bonaparte was on one of the frigates. In an instant, the sea was covered with rowboats. We vainly asked them to keep away. We were simply seized and brought ashore. And when we spoke to the crowd about the dangers they could face due to the lack of quarantine measures, they exclaimed, "Better the plague than the Austrians." I must say that this joyful excitement was beyond imagination unless witnessed. Everywhere along the road, from Acre to Lyon, in towns and villages, he was greeted with enthusiasm bordering on madness. This explosion of feelings and amazement, these hopes found everywhere, stirred the hearts of the French with the most cherished emotions and the noblest thoughts in their minds. It did not take a seer to predict that the days of the Directory were numbered.